Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the Independent Activists with me, Frank Hughes, in Belfast in the occupied British north of Ireland. And I'm honoured and delighted and very pleased that Christopher Helali has joined us today. I met Christopher in Morocco at a conference in May, but I believe we met before that. But for the life of me, I can't remember where it was. I thought it might have been Rome, but I'm not 100% sure. I haven't been on that many that I can forget them all, but time and age comes to us all. So you're very, very, very welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself then and let us know who you are, where you're from, and how life's treating you?
Sure, of course. My name is Christopher Helali. I'm the International Secretary of the American Communist Party. I'm also an independent journalist. I work with DD Geopolitics. I'm a GFCN expert and longtime anti-war and workers' rights activist, and very much involved in the anti-imperialist movement, which, by the way, is where we first met, which was 2018 at the anti-NATO conference in Ireland, in Dublin, if you remember that big gathering. And I remember because you had a Lugansk People's Republic flag on your lapel, and that's what originally attracted me to you. And we'll talk about my work in the Donbass as well as your work in the Donbass, I'm sure, over the years.
Yeah, that's amazing. You have a very good memory. I do remember that. That was in Liberty Hall in Dublin. And I remember people from the Communist Party of Ireland were there. And I remember a lot of people from America and a lot of people from all over the world. No, that was a great, 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 great conference. I, like a lot of people on this side of the Atlantic, don't really know. I think of America. I think of the American administration. I think of capitalism. I think of imperialism. I think of the war-mongering military-industrial complex. I think of the presidents who, like every single one of them in recent history, seems to have had their own war. It seems to be, you become the president, who you're going to attack, who you're going to overthrow, where you're going to throw American taxpayers' money along with American lives in their pursuit of greed and avarice. So maybe for, not just for myself, but for whoever watches this, could you give us a wee bit of history about, the Communist Party in America? When did it start? How long has it been going? Kind of numbers, what percentage it makes? Do you stand in the electoral process? Just give us a wee update, please.
Sure, of course. Well, we know very well that the labor movement history and sort of the socialist movement's history has real big foundations and roots also in the United States. The May 1st holiday goes back all the way to the Haymarket Massacre, which was in Chicago, if we remember, back in the 1800s. And of course, through the progressive era, during the Gilded Age, we had this very big movement of workers' rights. We had the IWW, the Socialist Labor Party, and so many other organizations, radical anarchists and socialists. After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, of course, very quickly after, a coalescence of different movements and groups came together. And of course, the American Communist Party was formed, later renamed the Communist Party of the United States of America. Now, that party, of course, finds its history all the way back to the beginning of sort of the communist movement internationally, and of course has a very storied legacy. And we know, of course, for many of your viewers, I'm sure, are aware of the Red Scares that we had in the United States, Palmer raids, McCarthyism, all of these things that really were tremendous pressure on communists and other left-wing activists to basically kick them out of positions of authority, of positions of power, teaching positions, any job that they held, especially in government, and to basically make them persona non grata at all levels of society. Of course, we had the big activism in the 60s and 70s, the anti-Vietnam War protests. We had, remember, Angela Davis, the Black Panthers. There were the New Left that came out. And of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, much of the major communist activism slowly started to wane. And since Occupy Wall Street in 2011, which I'm sure you remember was a big deal, after that, there's been a renewed resurgence. Of course, for someone like me, I grew up in a left-wing family, communist family, red diaper baby. So I had this sort of in my DNA. But younger people have come to it through seeing the crisis of capitalism, neoliberalism, the wars, the endless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the overthrow of Gaddafi and murder of Gaddafi in Libya, the Syrian regime change operation, what's going on in Palestine, the various coups and military interventions in Latin America, in Africa. So, of course, this is a big deal for a lot of people, and a lot of young people have come and moved towards our perspective, and especially from an anti-war, anti-imperialist perspective. So I would say that the state of the communist movement in the US is very much geared towards a major critique of US empire, a critique of capitalism. However, differences remain. So our party is fairly new because we reconstituted the Communist Party after last summer because primary issues. Number one, the old Communist Party had a lot of systemic and structural issues that were not able, they were not able to rectify because, of course, as with any organization, bureaucracy, money, and interests all play a part. But more than that for me, and why I left the Communist Party USA some years ago, was because they bought into Russiagate. They did not support the Donbass. They did not support Crimea. They had no real love for the Russian Federation and its just struggle against NATO. And I felt that my support for the people of the Donbass, my support for the people in Crimea, my support for all of the movements there, and the people who were on the ground, many of whom were who and remain my comrades, except those who we've lost along the way, that they needed, that their solidarity was more important than my membership in the Communist Party USA. So I left and became a member of another party. But in last year, we reconstituted, and our primary objective was support for Russia's special military operation, support for China, support for the DPRK, and most of all, support for the resistance in Palestine and the entire axis. Now, the old party still maintains sort of a labor Zionist position, which is that, okay, yes, Palestinians, it was a bad situation, but two people with two countries, sort of the two-state solution, but they don't even fully acknowledge the Nakba. There's also in the history of the CPUSA an understanding that the 1948 was the war of Jewish liberation and national independence, which of course is an absolute barbarous statement to make. And I do not acknowledge it in any capacity that that's what happened. I do not recognize such a thing as Jewish self-determination because Judaism is a religion. It's not an ethnicity. German Jews and Yemeni Jews have nothing in common besides their religion. Different cultures, different language, different traditions, different everything, different dress. So that's why they do not constitute a nation. And that's within the communist tradition, that the Jewish people as a whole, as a religious community, do not constitute a nation. And this was a big debate. And of course, for me, I said, how could it be that after October 7th, you could still be supporting the Zionist project? And they continue to do that. And they continue to invite the Communist Party of Israel over. And listen, I disagree with many of their things. Of course, there are activists there, and some of them do good work to confront Netanyahu and his regime, but they still uphold the state of Israel. And I do not accept that personally. So that's to give you a broad overview of what's going on. A lot of the biggest debates right now in the United States amongst the left are, is Russia anti-imperialist? Is China socialist? And do the Palestinians deserve their rights and their self-determination? These are some of the biggest issues of our time. And our party is firm, and I think the most committed on these three things. China is socialist and anti-imperialist, Russia is anti-imperialist, and the Palestinians deserve a state from the river to the sea.
100%. I couldn't agree more with you, actually, and I'm really, really, really glad you said that. It's important from time to time to restructure, because you can end up having what we would consider controlled opposition. So you have people on the left who talk good about socialism, they talk good about workers' rights, they talk good about the redistribution of wealth, free health, free education, social housing. But when it comes to foreign policy, we have the exact same issue here. Now, I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm on the left, but I don't self-define as a communist or as a whatever. I know the difference between right and wrong. For me, it's a moral question, and the moral question is we should have free education for everyone, free health, free housing, proper wages for people, proper structures in society, cheap fuel, cheap electricity. People should aspire to a good standard of life because the resources and the finances and the capital are all there if they're more equally distributed. So we have the Trotskyites here. Mm-hmm. We have groups like the Socialist Workers' Party, and they masquerade behind other incarnations So, for example, if somebody put up a vote for the Socialist Workers' Party poster in an election, they would get the same number of votes as the Workers' Party do, which is about 150 votes in a local council election. But they have this mechanism, people before profit. So it's a catch-all. They say it's a broad left church, but personally, I don't believe that, because the Socialist Party has one kind of outreach political organisation, and the SWP is another. But they wanted rid of Gaddafi. They wanted rid of Assad. They talked about we must support the people-led people's revolutions in these countries, which we all know, CIA, MI6, the French, whoever, Mossad, whoever else was involved in it. And we had the exact same thing with whenever they constitute themselves in order to masquerade who they really are, you know. And I'll talk about all the local political parties here. When we have rallies, I wouldn't have a politician anywhere near a rally if I had anything to do with it, because a lot of them are using Palestine and the death of Palestinians and the genocide in Palestine for votes. And that like disgusts me to my very, very, very core. So you've given us a wee bit of history, and I think it's very good that there's a new kind of it's important, not necessarily another organization that then copies the original organizational hierarchy and then people become invested in their own positions and stuff. But it's important that people have a choice. So young people in America seem to be drifting away from the I support Israel camp to I don't support genocide. Mm-hmm. So how do you think that's going to manifest itself going forward? Because short of revolution, the American electoral system, administration, deep state's not going to change. So how will radical people like yourself, how will young people who are anti-war and are even nationalist in the point of being like isolationist and insular, we should focus on America first, and that's homelessness, that's making sure people have the correct wages. You've had 50,000 jobs lost with UPS and 40,000 jobs lost with someone else. It seems like America is falling apart between the drug epidemic, homelessness, people struggling with the cost of living. How is it possible to bring all those disparate things together in one political broad church where you can have an effect, or are we just watching history repeat itself?
Listen, I think you're absolutely right in your diagnosis of the situation in the U.S. The U.S. is a declining country and society. I think everyone can see it. We have crumbling infrastructure. We have poor quality healthcare. We have poor outcomes, not only in education and healthcare, also with children, also with happiness, also with people's welfare and overall social well-being. So in most indicators, we continue to drop and fall as a country. And though the United States prides itself on being the number one hegemonic power and sort of the world revolves around it, it is slowly crumbling from its own hubris and I believe its own narcissism. And that's to say that a lot of the social ills that we're seeing are byproducts of that imperial and capitalist system. And so I believe that we need to have a movement that is able to encapsulate all of these demands from the workers, from families, from the people who don't want to see war anymore, who don't want to support genocide, who don't want to support apartheid. The problem is, and I think you rightfully diagnosed it, but on a much smaller scale, which I think is much a bigger problem in the US, is that when people come from the movement and get into political power, the money and the power comes on top of them, and they slowly shift towards appeasement of the system and appeasement of the US's allies. And of course, while they might speak nicely about the rights of Palestinian people and human rights, on the other hand, they fully support this genocidal state. And of course, we are referring to the Zionist entity. So when you think about that, when you understand that, you realize that the young people have overwhelmingly chosen Palestine to a greater or lesser extent. At the very least, they don't support genocide. To the greatest extent, they are fully on board with Palestinian liberation by any means necessary. So you have this great range amongst young people who are ready to support the resistance in all of the parties, be they Hamas, Islamic Jihad, PFLP, DFLP, you name it. and other young people who are like, okay, we support Palestinians in their struggle, but we want to do it, through diplomacy and things like that. Now, the problem remains how to transform that into political power. So a lot of these young people are going to be going to the ballot box in 2026. Next November are our midterm elections, right? So those midterm elections will define the following 2 years and the legislative makeup of the country. That is the Congress, the House, and the Senate. I would predict that a lot of candidates who are more critical of Israel are going to be able to get a leg up because of that young vote. There's a huge demographic shift in terms of support for Israel. It's mostly older people now. Younger people are not supportive. But the acquisition of social media technologies, the control of algorithms, the control of information is now a main primary focus of the Zionists. Why? Because they want to try to stem and turn the tide. They want to stop this hemorrhaging of the loss of support because they know that it will translate later down the road to a financial, military, and political cost. And they want to try to at least capture again 10 to 20% of the young people to try to make it, okay, maybe not 50-50, but 60-40, something to that effect, right? In that sense, I think that we are in an existential crisis right now because the social media platforms that are used by young people are now slowly falling into the hands of people who are going to limit the reach of pro-Palestinian content. And the reason why so many people are supportive of Palestine today is because the truth has finally entered their homes when they have never seen it before, even though that reality existed. You and I well know. I've been to Palestine. You've been there. We've seen it on the ground. We've seen it up close and personal. That history has been ongoing since 1948. So it's not that it's anything new. It's just that they have access now where the mainstream media had blocked access before. So I think the biggest issue for us, especially as younger people in the United States, people who are getting into the realm of political power, getting into the ages where we can now be elected. And I am an elected official in the United States as of now. As of last November, I was elected. What that means ultimately is we want to try to change the narrative and the support. However, there are so many structural constraints that for me, it warrants the need for broader structural change. I don't necessarily mean a revolution, and I don't necessarily think it's going to be violent at this point, but there has to be some transformation that goes on because the power of the lobbies like AIPAC, the power of the military-industrial complex, the power of all of these special interests and lobbies are enormous and disproportional to the power of the people. And I think that until that's addressed, I don't quite know how we'll be able to translate all of this popular support into political power.
I totally agree with you because what you're saying is mirrored not only in Ireland and the UK, but across Europe. I don't believe I live in a democracy. I believe I live in a duopoly. It used to be you've got the Democrats and the Republicans. Britain's got the Tories and Labour. Ireland's got Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and now Sinn Féin. You have Social Democrats in Germany, and you have the Greens and whoever else is involved in that kind of political context and contest. So we have exactly the same problems. The problem I have with politics is I don't trust the people who become elected because somebody stands outside, we'll call it Parliament, and they say, vote for me, vote for change, get these people out. They're corrupt and they're corrupted by the system. And 20 years later, they have become part of the system. They then defend the system. And then someone like us is standing outside saying, get those people out. They've been corrupt for 20 years. And we've seen it. They make promises in opposition. And as soon as they go into power, Trump was going to stop the Ukraine war overnight. What happened? Now he's talking about giving Tomahawk cruise missiles to the fascists in Kiev. So I want to touch on 2 points. One of them is, which you've already talked about, how you can harness this disgust at the genocide, but also American hegemony and European hegemony across the globe. And then we need to kind of weld that too. I've been saying this for probably a decade. Europe appears to be back in the 1930s. We have the rise of fascism, which I personally feel a lot of that's being fueled by Zionism. They want to make immigrants and Muslims the enemy. So the Jew is not your enemy. It's the refugee from Sudan. It's the refugee from Libya. It's the refugee from Syria. It's the Muslims who are the threat. Mm-hmm. So you have that on one hand. Then you have the rise of the left as such. With the rise of fascism, then you're going to get the counterbalance. You're going to get people who are going to come out that are against it. And you kind of see that in America as well. You've got the MAGA movement, you've got the nationalists, you've got the people on the right and the evangelical Christian Zionists. And then you have the people in Portland, Oregon, and the guys singing outside the ice camps and the people walking about with the big, with the big costumes on. They are rearming in Europe, and they are planning to have a war with Russia. They've talked about it openly in the United Kingdom, 2029. They're talking about conscription in Germany. They can't get people to join the armed forces. So they're going to conscript people. They're going to build up this war machine because they want to break Russia down into 9 component parts. They want the minerals and whatever else comes from that. So, I mean, are we literally watching history repeat itself? Because what appears to be happening in Italy is it appears to be on the edge. There's people on the streets taking on the state and taking on the cops. I think you might see more of that in America and Greece and Spain. There's authoritarianism on behalf of the state, and there's people who have no, what's the best way to describe it? They not only do they not have faith in the system, but they don't have a place in society. I think the way that I want to describe that. Once you take away people's opportunities in society, then people are going to rebel. So, are we heading towards more of a crackdown? You have troops, National Guard in DC or whatever, are we heading towards authoritarianism in these Western neoliberal kind of countries, or are we slowly, inexorably heading towards crisis, violence, rebellion, revolution? I mean, can you see any of that in the future?
I mean, I certainly predict that we're entering a much more violent period in contemporary history. I see it as well. I see that the rampant wealth inequality domestically and the drive for resources internationally is leading once again to conflict within Europe, in the West, and then beyond that in the entire global South. I mean, right now we have warships and B-1 bombers flying and for Venezuela. I mean, we have threats against Nicaragua and Cuba, as always. We have threats in Africa against the anti-imperialist governments of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. We see ongoing belligerence of the United States and its allies, regional allies, its proxies in Asia against the DPRK, against China. And of course, we still have an active war against the Russian Federation by all of NATO and its proxies and allies. Not to mention the ongoing, greater Zionist project that's taking shape in the entire region, and the bombing 7+ countries, 8+ countries now have been, dragged into this unwillingly. So I think that when you look at that in its totality, you have to make, I think, the accurate assessment that violence is inevitable at this point. The question of how to overcome that violence would be a complete transformation of the social, political, economic structures of the Western world. But that's not going to happen, as you well know. The European Union is a massive imperial project. Its economic engine is Germany, which siphons off all of the capital, especially from the periphery. You remember they used to call them the pigs: Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain, right? So when you understand that the periphery is slowly, losing steam, and you see people on the streets in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, you see a housing crisis in Ireland. I had been to Ireland not too long ago, and the housing crisis in Dublin is unbelievable. Irish people who've been there for generations, who suffered under the worst of the colonial period, of the famine. Their ancestors can't even have housing in an Irish city because of the demands placed by international capital there and the speculation and the housing crisis that's been created. So when all of this is taken into account, the easiest scapegoat, as you rightfully point out, is now to place the blame on migrants and Muslims, because that serves the narrative that we must militarily support Israel, which is a battleship against all of Islamic nations in the Middle East. So, it's very interesting. For the far right, they understand Israel as the battleship for attacking Muslim countries. For the DPRK and us communists, we see it as a colonial outpost for the West to impose its will on the region. And so the one of them is correct and our position is correct ultimately. But I want to say that the Zionists now are very committed, as are the far right, in alliance. They're in alliance now. And by the way, they have always been in alliance. And this must be true and must be understood by everyone, that there was a natural tendency towards cooperation between fascists and Zionists, because Zionism is also a racist, supremacist ideology. It's just that they didn't want the Jews in their country. They wanted to have a state for the Jews, and they can do their project over there, right? And so that's why, Zionism can have an anti-Semitic dimension, because it's Jews anywhere else, they are just cosmopolitan. They should all go back and do aliyah and go to the land and take it over and colonize. So in broad strokes, I think that a lot of the social instability that we're seeing is artificial, in the sense that it's being promoted and supported by entities that want to deepen the crisis in the West because it helps to benefit them. And think about this. I always think about the imperial boomerang, which was the Aimé Césaire's concept, which is that the violence that was wrought on the colonies will eventually be brought home. All of those tools and techniques are now being brought home. And we see this with the militarization of police in America. We see this with all of these operations that are ongoing, ICE. We actually even refer to a lot of these operations in a derogative sense, as sort of the US's own special military operation, to use that language against the US when they like to, of course, label all these other countries authoritarian. Well, it looks like, how is the special military operation going in Portland and going on in these other cities? And the problem, of course, is that these are people who are being deprived of their civil liberties and their civil rights. We as communists stand with everyone, actually, and this differentiates us from other left-wing parties. We stand for the full access of civil rights and civil liberties of everyone. And we understand that if one group gets their rights constricted, we will have our rights constricted, which is why I don't necessarily, myself personally, I speak personally, and I'm sure I speak for many people in our party, we don't believe in the cancel culture, because we believe that the real canceling will come with people's knowledge and consciousness raising. That's when they understand the truth. And so if we block these people from speaking, we are now blocked from speaking. And that's what's ended up happening, right? Under the Biden administration, those people were targeted who were maybe pro-Trump or MAGA or pro-Russian. And now we're also targeted on the other side, right? And so I just think that we have to be very careful and understanding of the context of the different countries in the West that are experiencing these profound crises. And once we can understand them and analyze them, we have to then build strong coalitions and partnerships on the ground to help to overcome a lot of these issues that are now becoming much more destabilizing for our societies. I mean, if you just think about the younger generation, they're growing up with really little hope. What hope in the future? The hope of a middle-class life is all but gone. Their only future that they know they're going to have is debt. Credit card debt, student loan debt, housing debt, debt for medical expenses. So especially in the United States, they really have no alternative but to then think about broader transformation. But how to translate that, as we said before, is the real big question. But there's no doubt in my mind that violence to a greater or lesser extent is on the horizon. And let's be honest, we've already seen that in the United States. We've seen 2 assassination attempts against Trump. We've seen the assassination of Charlie Kirk. We've seen the assassination of different Democratic and Republican activists, politicians, and things like that. We've seen mass violence in some of our cities. We have a major epidemic of gun violence. So when you look at that in totality, you say, this country is ripe for an explosion. The question is, when does that explosion come and in what form? I couldn't say. If I did say, I would, give us some money and we could bet on it. But because we're not speculators and we don't have a crystal ball, we don't know. But what we do know is we need to build strong and resilient communities now to be able to withstand what is to come, to be able to provide the support and solidarity necessary if the situation becomes more unstable for many people around the country, and I believe around the world.
I just wish more people thought like that. I actually wish more people had the time to think like that. I can't speak for yourself. I can only speak for me. I'm very lucky. I have time to educate myself. I have time to look into things, I understand, like my partner's got 4 children and they've all children of their own. And, they're busy paying a mortgage, they're busy going to work, they're taking kids to after schools clubs, they're trying to have a quality of life, and they don't have the time and the luxury to maybe look deeply into some of the things that we've been involved in and some of the things we've looked at. But there's an awful lot to unpack there from what you said, but I'll just pick maybe 2 or 3 things. Like, one of them is the apathy towards the political system. Less and less people are voting. Less and less people have faith in the system. A lot of people are turning their backs. That suits the system. They don't care if it goes down to only 40% of the electorate vote. So long as they get 15% of that 40%, they're going to get re-elected into their positions of power. You're talking about a society living with injustice. People's lives are being destroyed. You're talking about money trickling up. Thatcher and Reagan talked about the trickle down. The money will go to the top and then it'll trickle down to the people at the bottom, but it's gone the opposite. So you're right, the middle class is disappearing. You have homelessness. You have people with 2 jobs. You have people struggling to survive. You have people going to food banks. And then you have the mega rich. And you have the electoral process and administration being run by billionaires. Why would a billionaire want to get into politics to earn $250,000 a year when he can get that in his own company or as a tax write-off or as a tax gift? But when we're talking about revolution, I've always felt that you only get a revolution when people don't have anything. It's when the father can't put bread on the table that people come together and say something must be done. I agree that violence is on the radar going forward across the whole of Western society, because I believe people are going to demand a better life. They're going to demand a better form of government and administrative management. And as soon as they call for that, the state's going to repress them. You can see in Germany, they're beating the living daylights out of people who go out with a Palestinian flag. If you give a 7-year-old a Palestinian flag, they're going to be arrested. If you're wearing a keffiyeh and you say something to the police, you're going to get those. An Irish girl in Berlin, I don't know whether or not you saw the videos, the punch her in the face.
In the face, I saw that. It was horrible.
If you did that on the street, you'd be charged with GBH, grievous bodily harm, or actual assault. But the state seems to be able to do it. So for me, that's where the violence is going to come from. It's not going to be generic or organic from the ground up. People will come out and rightly demand change. Then the state's going to come down on them. And we already have right-wing vigilantes in Belfast and in Dublin. And it's quite scary. I wouldn't like to be a person of colour at night living, working, or travelling through certain areas where those people are literally at physical risk of being in harm's way. These people have become emboldened, and there's more and more and more of it. So, as I said about the 30s, when you had the communists and the socialists and you had the fascists fighting on the streets, I mean, there are clashes already, not to that same level or to that same extent, but you're correct in the divide and conquer that they use as part of their foreign policy is now being used internally within Western society to fracture the populace so we don't come together demanding fairness and equality, that people then are at each other's throats. So yeah, it's not looking good, and there's no crystal ball, as you've mentioned, there's no magic wand. But I just wonder, honestly, like in 10 years' time, will America be living with troops on the corner?
It's very possible. It's very possible that this could happen. Already. It's interesting because I had mentioned this, but now you bring it. We can really expand on this. The war on terror was the perfect opportunity to reimagine what local police do in America. So local police were okay, not like a Bobby, for example, in England, where they just have a billy club and they don't have a pistol. They had pistols, but they were a little bit more or less, especially in rural areas, not so much in the face in terms of violence. They were there. They of course had force of arms. They had their weapons, but it wasn't so. It wasn't to a level where they'd be like a gendarmerie. They'd be like sort of an internalized military force. Now, of course, after the war on terror, and after all of this surplus equipment was sold off to police departments in one of the most magical Ponzi schemes you can imagine, the taxpayer pays to have this equipment. The government then has this equipment and then sells it once again to local police departments. And so the taxpayer has paid double for this equipment. One, to produce it for the government, then the government sold it. And I don't even know what happened to the proceeds, but clearly they went into somebody's coffers. So when you think about what they purchased, Humvees, armored personnel carriers, M16s, advanced technical equipment, including what they call a Stingray, which is basically a fake cell phone tower that captures cell phone communications. Why does a small police department in Podunk, USA need that? Well, if you ask someone like me, and I'm sure someone like you, this is part of a creation of a network of control, because you can monitor and surveil people. And we already know, thanks to not only the great work of Julian Assange exposing war crimes, but also Edward Snowden, who now lives here in Moscow, that the US is actively surveilling the population. So you have police that now have surveillance technology, advanced weaponry, and basically war machines. These are military vehicles, military-grade vehicles that are bomb-proof, IED-proof, and you name it. So when you end up looking at your local police department, it looks more like the National Guard or the U.S. Army, or a unit of the U.S. Army. So I think that it's happening in a way that's sort of like the boiling frog analogy, that by the time Americans understand, it's too late, because now all their police departments have camouflage and M16s, and they are no longer really police. They're military, they're domestic military force. I think that we're already there, to be honest. We are in the process. It's been 2 decades of this kind of development, and we are firmly there. And I've written about this over 10 years ago, and it's come to pass that this was always the tendency and the trajectory. And even the worst of our conspiracies, when people would call us all sorts of names, have proven true and have borne fruit now in what we're seeing on American streets today.
Yeah, I think what we're witnessing is the transition from the police to a paramilitary force. And we're witnessing the transition of their role, which was to support law and order, to protect and serve. They're now protecting and serving not the people, but the government and its domestic and local policies. Well, I think we kind of went all over the place there, which isn't a bad way to have an organic conversation that just grows from the introduction. But our time's up. I'd like to thank you very much, and I'd like to get a proper talk with you sometime. We could maybe do this again, and I'll structure the questions properly, because we were kind of shotgun there all over the place. But I personally found it very interesting. So I'd just like to encourage people to subscribe to the channel, share, and like, and I'll send you a link once it's put out, and hopefully you'll share it too. So, Chris, anything you'd like to say in conclusion, buddy? The mic's yours. Go ahead.
I just want to thank you for this amazing opportunity. Thank all of our listeners and followers, and of course, free Palestine.
Free Palestine, from the river to the sea, buddy.
From the river to the sea.